in Hollywood style, I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to start at the end of a process that's seen a few of the largest media companies in the world consolidate to aggregate. And that's left us in a position where a huge amount of content spending, so spending on TV rights, film rights, sports rights, TV production, goes through just two groups. And it's not Netflix and Amazon. It is Disney and Comcast. So the Fox acquisition and the Sky acquisition and the earlier consolidation of Comcast and NBC Universal has left these two companies in control of about 20% of all global spending on content. And that number is nearly 40% in the US. So $1 in $5 spent on all of those rights or production goes through just one of those groups. So how did we end up in a situation where so much of the market was concentrated with so few companies? So let's rewind a bit and have a look at some of the underlying trends, and then explore what does that mean for other companies in the market? What does it mean for many of the European or international broadcasters present in this room? So, on the surface, it's worth noting that despite the doom and gloom and the pressures the industry is facing, the audiovisual market itself actually looks relatively healthy. If we look at aggregate revenue from the whole AV sector, and that is pay television, it's commercial broadcasting, it's public TV spending, it's theatrical, it's online video, it's everything. Back in 2013, the market was worth about $472 billion worldwide for all of that content. By the end of 2018, that expanded to well over $500 billion, $552 billion. So it's still growing, and it's a fairly healthy rate. It's about 3% growth per year on average. But of course, we know that things are changing in a slightly different way. And when we look at developed markets, for instance, if we look at the UK, we can see that beneath the surface of that headline number, there are changes afoot. So this chart illustrates revenue for each of those different segments, but inflation adjusted, so taking out some of the inflationary effects. So this is really what's happening when we're thinking about the costs that many of the companies present in each of these sectors are exposed to. And what becomes quite apparent when you do this adjustment is that most of the sectors are in decline. So pay TV revenues in real decline, commercial broadcasting in decline, public TV in decline, theatrical in decline, and the home entertainment sector in decline. The only two areas still growing are the online video advertising market, so the YouTubes and also the catch-up players and the Facebook videos, and the subscription online video sector. So the two segments basically taking all of that real growth in the market. And it's not just a matter of saturation. It's not just the fact that the pay TV market's got about as big as it could be. There is a direct substitutive effect of online video to those sectors. So I'm going to show you a few scatter plots. I'm not sorry. The first is one of what is the impact of Netflix on pay TV growth. Now, we know what the effects have been in the US market. We've seen consistent cord cutting over the last few years, but it's been much more difficult to pick up in international markets, largely because the household base is still growing in a lot of territories. So pay TV companies are actually able to hold ground, at least in subscriber terms. So what I've done on this chart is we've correlated on the horizontal axis penetration of Netflix in 2017, and then on the vertical axis, the change in pay TV penetration over a 2-year period, so from 2016 through to 2018. Now, it's quite messy and noisy at the bottom end of the chart, but it's broadly speaking, if Netflix penetration is low, pay TV is still growing. But as we move towards the right of the chart and Netflix penetration ticks up, you can start to see that changes. And in fact, there are no markets worldwide where Netflix had reached 30% penetration, household penetration a year ago, where the pay TV market is still in growth. And in fact, if you look at that 20% mark, there's only one market where Netflix penetration has reached over 20%, where the pay TV market is still in growth. So there's a direct impact on pay TV. Now, the same's occurring, of course, with viewing. Now, there's another scatter plot, and this represents the impact on broadcast viewing of subscription online video services. So again, horizontal axis, we've seen the change over the last 2 years in the amount of subscription video on demand that people think they consume. So each one of these dots represents a country worldwide. So generally, we've seen people watching more subscription video on demand over the last few years. On the vertical axis, that's the associated change in broadcast viewing. So it's going down. And there is almost a direct one-to-one correlation. For every minute more subscription video on demand watched, as a minute less of linear TV watched. So direct impact. And it's not just viewing, it's viewers. So if we think about the aggregate audiences for the channels, the broadcast channels, we can start to see that many of the big incumbents in the space are actually losing viewers entirely, not recapturing them. So back in Q1 2016, the proportion of UK internet users who'd watched at least the BBC or ITV or Channel 4 channels in the preceding month was around about just below 90% of our respondents. If we fast forward through to Q3 2018, that number's dropped to about 82, 83%. So a meaningful loss in viewers. Now, some of those are being recaptured by services like iPlayer and ITV Hub and All4, but not all of them. So what's fueling this shift? Well, we know massive investment in content is the name of the game at the moment that Netflix is spending, depending on how you account for it, somewhere between $8 billion a year to $13 billion if you look at that cash flow. And that means that there are a huge volume of new shows hitting the market. And in fact, if we look at the top commissioners worldwide, so if we take the top 20 TV commissioners globally, online video players are responsible for around about a third of the commissioning activity in that group. So this pie chart represents all of the brand new TV shows hitting the market. There are thousands of these. OTT players, Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, and their counterparts take about 31%, and that's more than the top public service broadcasters. It's more than the pay broadcasters, HBO or AMC or Sky, and it's only just behind the aggregate power of the commercial broadcasting sector, the ABCs and the ITVs and the NBCs and so on. Now, when we look at that in a little bit more detail, we can see it's not just confined to a small number of companies. We can start to see that Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, Apple, and others are all spending large amounts of money producing new content. So this represents that chart broken out and broken down, the number of new titles that each one of these companies is putting into market. So it's what's in production over the next 12 to 18 months. So hopefully one thing that's fairly obvious to see is that Netflix alone has about twice as many titles in production as its nearest competitors. So huge, huge number of new TV shows hitting the market. So if you were a European or a smaller international or global broadcaster, you might be looking at this and thinking, crikey. But all is not lost yet. If we think about the way in which these services are competing, there is differentiation in the market. And in fact, European services, when we look at them, are very differentiated from the content mix and the localization mix of some of the big US players. So if we start with a very high-level genre view, so if we look at all of those upcoming commissions, what's in there? The two bars here, or the two sides of these bars, represent the proportion of those titles that are scripted content, so drama or comedy series, for instance, and the proportion that's unscripted, documentary, reality, and entertainment. On the left-hand side, you can see quite clearly, in particular, Netflix, Amazon, and Apple, highly focused on scripted. They've done very well with their drama series, their science fiction series, and many of the other titles that we know and love. So very, very, very much focused on that one area. YouTube and Facebook are a little bit different. We'll come on to those later. By contrast, if we look at some of the European broadcasters, I'll pick the UK broadcasters here, we can see that there's a much more even mix. There's a lot of unscripted in there. There's documentaries, there's lighter entertainment shows, there's reality shows. So for those consumers wanting to get their reality or entertainment fix, they very much have to go to the broadcasters right now. And of course, there's also a local relevance point to make here. If we look at those same commissions and look at where they're originated, we can see a very different split. So on the right-hand side here, we can see most of the content from the UK broadcasters is of UK origin, whereas on the left-hand side here, it's of US origin. Now, even Netflix, which is making massive internationalization, massive localization efforts, such that US productions are only about half of its upcoming shows now. Even there, Netflix is spread across 200 different markets worldwide, so only 6% of its upcoming shows are UK origin. So if we think about where UK broadcasters and other European broadcasters are at the moment, there is a differentiation point that certain types of content you won't get on the subscription online video services. But that's not going to be true forever. And if we think about how Netflix's strategy in particular has evolved and what their original mix looks like over the years, this is how that's shifted in terms of that scripted, unscripted mix. So at the top here, we can see the proportion of all the Netflix originals that are drama, comedy, family series, so effectively the scripted bucket. And at the bottom here, we can see the reality, documentary entertainment, the unscripted angle. And there's been a steady increase in the proportion of those shows. So that competitive differentiation is not necessarily going to be around forever. And that's important for many of these subscription OTT players when we think about where their growth is now going to be coming from. And when we think about the demographics and where these changes have been occurring to date, we often think about younger consumers. We think about millennials, really. They're the ones watching online video. That's where the consumption patterns are changing. And that's true. That's certainly true. If we look at the broadcast viewing time and how that's shifted over the last few years, what we've done here is indexed claimed linear viewing across about 14 markets. This is an aggregate of about 100,000 interviews that we've conducted over the last few years, all indexed back to Q3 2017 for each of the different demographic groups. And we can see that the 55 to 64-year-olds, actually, they've only lost about 9% of their linear TV viewing over that time period. And actually, a lot of that's shifted to DVRs. Whereas the 18 to 24-year-old group, massive declines, 21% lower than back in Q3 2017. So, okay, so younger consumers are watching less linear TV. What's new? But it's actually the older group that's perhaps more interesting now. The older group, certainly in the UK, is one of the fastest growing portions of the subscription video on demand market. So this chart represents the breakdown of subscription video on demand customers by age bracket and how that's changed over that same time span. Back in Q3 2015, just 8% of subscription video on demand customers were aged 55 to 64. By Q3 2018, that's increased to around about 11%, and the proportion of 18 to 24-year-olds in the mix has decreased. Now, if we look at certain services, Netflix in particular, that 55 to 64-year-old group is really what's driving a lot of the growth now, and the 45 to 54. In that oldest bracket, uptake's increased by about threefold over the last few years for Netflix in the UK. And that's important when we consider both the impact on commissioning strategies, but also the impact on viewing, the impact on the existing services that many of these consumers use. If we think about the way that viewing unfolds at the moment, generally you'll see numbers that look a little bit like these. So what this represents are the minutes per person per day across about 16 markets here that different age groups spend or think they spend watching subscription video on demand. So the average 18 to 24-year-old thinks they spend about 40 minutes per day watching subscription video on demand. The average 55 to 64-year-old thinks they spend about 8 minutes. But of course, that's because not so many of those 55 to 64-year-olds actually have a subscription video on demand service. If we zoom in purely to those who've already started watching subscription video on demand, we've got the blue bar there. It's about the same. So once 55 to 64-year-olds and the 45 to 54-year-olds are actually converted into using subscription video on demand, they watch just about as much as the younger age brackets. So there's clearly a time issue here, that time is running out to adapt to some of these changes as audiences shift. So I'm going to finish off with a couple of conclusions now. Now, as we've seen, demography and the content mix will mean that European broadcasters and international broadcasting groups are differentiated, will remain competitive in certain fields. As we've seen, that's changing. Demography is changing, and of course the content commissioning strategies of some of the big new players is also changing. Now, one thing I didn't mention earlier when looking at some of the volumes of some of those major services like Netflix and Amazon and Hulu is the cost. And the US content giants in particular are able to spend many multiples more per hour on content. So $1, $2, $3, $4 million per hour of programming. And that's simply very difficult to compete with if you're a single market European broadcaster. And with ongoing consolidation, this is likely to only get worse. So there are a few strategies I think European broadcast groups I know are, but also should be considering. So one of those is a consolidation and or collaboration. So each individual European market is obviously smaller than the US, but in aggregate, it's a larger market. Use co-productions to share the cost of TV production. Now, we've seen many European broadcasters actually engage in co-productions with Netflix and Amazon and then think, oh, hang on, why are we doing this? But of course, there's a huge appetite for co-productions and collaboration, and we've seen a shift in strategy from collaborating with the Netflixes and Amazons to collaborating with one another. Lastly, developing series and formats with international export in mind. That's easier said than done, but it's certainly true that, in particular, UK content travels extremely well. So on this, I'm going to leave with a final statistic that of the top most searched for series on subscription video on demand in the US last year, about 6% were of UK origin. And I can probably guarantee that UK producers were not getting 6% of US content budgets. So with that, I'm going to finish. I think I've maybe run over, so I don't know whether we'll have time for questions, but thank you very much.